Hello, hello, and welcome to the fundamentals of game music, the craft and business of making music for games. This is going to be an in-depth workshop on pretty much everything you need to know on how to make game music, how to break into the games music industry, and some other insider tricks. But before I go further, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Matt Kenyon, if we have not met. I am the host of a podcast called Composer Code, where I interview video game composers. I'm also a composer myself, and just generally a student of the craft of composition. So who is this course for? Well, I think this course is going to apply to a lot of people. One is if you're a musician and you just want to better understand how game composition works. Maybe you want to do it on the side. Maybe even you want to turn this into a career. Two is those very people who are like, okay, I want to do this. I want to break into the game composition space and I want to know how. What skills do I need to know? Who do I need to talk to? How do I get hired? We're going to talk about that. And this is also for indie game devs looking to create their own music. Lots of indie game devs, either because they're operating on a shoestring budget or just because they're very passionate about their games and their IPs. They want to protect that. And they want to have creative control over every aspect. A lot of indie game devs these days are creating their own music, which I think is awesome. And so if that's you, I hope that you will take a lot of value out of this course. So here's what I hope you'll take away from this course that I think will be around an hour. I hope so. One is you'll understand the role and the function of game music, the purpose of game music, which is important to grasp. We're going to talk about some actionable tips for better composition. So we're going to get down into some nitty-gritty stuff of really how to write, just plain and simple, better music. I'm going to give you guys a blueprint and strategies for breaking into the game composition space. Now, these are things that I have gleaned from about 30 hours of conversation from industry professionals. So this is definitely solid gold stuff straight from the masters. I'm going to talk about the skills that every game composer should have or should be working on. And I'm going to go through some personal technological favorites, DAWs, VSTs, just some technology that I have found to be very helpful. And we're going to talk about some productivity and workflow hacks, because if you're a game composer and you want to be a freelancer, you got to learn how to keep yourself productive and optimize your workflow. All right, so real quick, I just want to say right off the bat, I'm not going to sell you anything. I come from the digital marketing world, and a lot of times in the digital marketing world, they have these webinars, and at the end of the webinar, they try to sell you something. I am not opposed to that at all. I have no moral opposition to that, but I just want to tell you, if you're bracing for the pitch, you're not going to find one. This is just pure information. I just want to give this knowledge back. However, there is something you can do to help me that I would really appreciate. On this page, you're going to find a form. Or if you're on YouTube, you'll find it. You can just leave a comment. But you'll find a form on this page for feedback. I, full disclosure, am going to create a paid course, but I want this paid course to be as valuable as possible. I realize there are so many things I could cover in the VGM world. I don't want it to be fluffy. I don't want it to be full of stuff that people don't want to see. So what I want you to do is I just want you to keep your eyes and ears open as I do this presentation. If there's anything that I say that you want to know more about, that you're like, man, I wish you would spend more time on that, please leave me that feedback. Please leave me that feedback. Just let me know which of these topics you would like to know more about. Okay, that's it. Moving on. So what is the role of game music? What is it supposed to do? What's its intended function? Let's talk about that. So the role of game music, I believe, is number one, immersion. Video games are an escape, right? We go to video games, even all the way back to Pong, right? And of course, they've gotten much more immersive than that. But we go to video games to escape. We go to video games to enter into a reality other than our own. Whether it's an amazing story, whether it's we want to assume the role of someone else like in an RPG or an adventure game, or whether we just want to beat people up and shoot people like in Doom or a first-person shooter. We go to video games to escape. And a huge part of that is the music. The music has a massive role in immersing a player in a world and creating this suspension of disbelief that the player must have in order to fully be immersed in the game. The second thing that game music does is it accentuates things. Accentuation is a huge responsibility of game music. Think about jump scares, right? Every jump scare has an accompanying musical stinger that goes along with it. Here's another example. Solving a puzzle in Zelda is satisfying, but there's nothing quite as satisfying as solving a puzzle and also hearing this jingle. The role of game music is to accentuate gameplay on screen. Another role of game music is to evoke emotion. I mean, it is music after all. Music is one of the most emotionally evocative things in existence. So music in games has a powerful, powerful way to evoke emotion, whether it's sadness, joy, jubilee, elation, surprise, fear, anxiety out of the player. Music has a big part of that. And information. Now, this is very interesting. I love music that actually plays a critical design function in the game. For example, if you've played Sonic, you probably know what information this song is communicating. And of course, anybody who's played any Mario game knows what information this jingle is communicating. If you were playing the game on mute, yeah, Sonic has the little countdown timer, but in the case of Mario, if you're playing the game on mute, you would have no idea that the game is telling you to hurry up. So this is the kind of important information that's relayed through game music. So game music is dynamic, and you've probably heard that several times before. Game music changes based on user input. This is what sets it apart from film music or really any other medium. But how does that actually work? Okay, you tell me game music is dynamic. What in the world does that even mean? How does it actually function inside of a game? How do different scenarios play themselves out musically? Well, there's a few techniques that composers and sound programmers use to create dynamic music in games, and I want to talk about a few of those now. So the first is vertical layering. So vertical layering is exactly what it sounds like. It's stacking or removing layers of a piece based on specific conditions. So let's do a hypothetical example here. Let's say we're playing a first-person shooter. Okay, in the exploration phase of the game, the player is just exploring a new map. You might just have a basic percussive layer. Okay, so then all of a sudden, off in the distance, let's say you cross a certain threshold, a trigger set up in-game, and then you see some enemies. So then maybe there's a droning bass that adds. It's adding energy, but it's one of those things where it's like you don't really even notice it, you just kind of feel it. Then next up, maybe the enemies notice the player. Okay, so then there's the synth chord. So the enemies have now noticed the player and they're on high alert. Now the player is actually engaging the enemy. Okay, so there's epic strings playing. This is full force, this is fever pitch. There's a full battle scene going on, and then once the player has eliminated all of the enemies, it goes all the way back to the percussive layer. And the game, the really cool thing is that the way that the game programmer set it up, and we'll talk more about implementation later in this course, but the way the game programmer set it up is all of these layers can basically come and go at will. But the thing is that they never change. They don't change tempo. They're the same key so that they can be freely added on top of one another and removed without any sort of disruption in the immersion. So explaining it in a slide deck is one thing, but let's look at some actual examples of vertical layering. A very basic yet highly effective example is in Super Mario World. A percussive bongo layer is added on top of the bass composition whenever Mario mounts Yoshi, and the track seamlessly goes on and off depending on whether or not Mario is riding him. Next up, let's take a look at Banjo-Kazooie. Now, a lot of adventure games use this technique. You have two different tracks, one layered on top of the other, and one is the main track, the bass composition of the overworld. The second one is the underwater track. They'll usually put a low pass filter on the underwater track, making things sound very muffled, taking out all the high end, and maybe muting some of the instruments. As the player transitions from above water to underwater, the system then crossfades between these two tracks, the main overworld theme and the underwater theme. Check out this puzzle from Portal 2. So as the player is reflecting the lasers into their appropriate spots, more and more layers are being added, signaling to the player through the music that they're succeeding. And when they make a wrong move, layers are taken away, signaling to the player that they just made an incorrect move. Another cool function is the arpeggio in Portal 2 that plays over the bass soundtrack whenever the player is sliding on the propulsion gel. This gives the player a distinct sense of momentum, but also lets them know that the gel is having its intended effect. And the cool thing is, as the chords change in the bass composition, so does this underlying arpeggio. Again, this is as simple as having an arpeggio layer, vertically layered like we're talking about, on top of the bass composition, and it basically just fades in and fades out depending on whether or not the player is on the propulsion gel. All right, so the next strategy, we talked about vertical layering. Now let's talk about horizontal resequencing. So horizontal resequencing is a fairly simple idea. It's just what I've written here. You transition from one track to another based on a specific game event. So you have track A, you have an inciting incident or a trigger, and then track B begins to play. However, things get very complicated because then you must ask, okay, well, how do you get from track A to track B? Do you just crossfade? Do you do phrase branching? Do you do demarcation? These are all terms that audio programmers have to be familiar with. So let's take a look at a few in-game examples. So let's take a look at Halo 2. So the first 5 to 7 minutes of this level are totally silent, and not only is it really, really cool that this happens, but it's also a very important design decision. So after the player eliminates a certain amount of enemies, all of a sudden the battle music crossfades into the scene from silence. Now, the really interesting thing is that because the Halo developers have trained us as players, okay, whenever it goes from silence to music, that means a battle is coming. Watch what happens to the player when the music starts. He automatically, instinctively looks up to the sky for a Covenant dropship. This is a masterclass in using music for game design. Let's look at another way to horizontally resequence, and this is called phrase branching. And a great example of this is from Monkey Island 2. So phrase branching is basically crossfade on hard mode, because basically what you're doing is every area has unique music in this point and click classic game, but instead of simply crossfading into each new track, which is frankly pretty easy to do, the composers actually had to write 1 to 2 bar compositions that play depending on which area you enter. So like, let's say you go from area A to area B, you might have a 1 to 2 bar composition to make that seamless transition, or area B to area D, or area A to area D. There's all these permutations. And the last piece of dynamic music are loops. Now, loops don't seem very dynamic because they just kind of loop, but obviously when a player beats the level, it has to change to a new piece of music, so it is technically dynamic, but it is probably the most static form of dynamic music because it's 90 to 120 seconds that repeats. Now, loops are have to be very melodic because you're going to hear them a lot, which is why loops can sometimes, not always, but sometimes be some of the most challenging things to write, because you essentially have to solve the problem of, okay, well, how do I write a 90-second piece of music that will loop infinitely that won't get annoying? We know it's possible because we have some of the most incredible video game melodies and harmonies of all time were written on looping systems. Personally, I love writing loops because this is sort of my sweet spot. I was raised in the 90s. Some of my most influential composers are the classic Nintendo guys, and so this is right in my sweet spot. So you have these old games that use loops, but then you have newer games who are really kind of bringing back a loop renaissance. Indie games like Shovel Knight and Crypt of the Necrodancer Celeste, things like that. All right, so now you have a primer on how game music functions, and we're going to talk later about how it's actually implemented. But before that, we need to talk about probably the largest and most important topic, and that's the actual craft of composition. None of the things I just mentioned matter if you can't write a good tune. You might know all the stuff that I just shared. You might know everything about implementation. You might be the best audio programmer ever, and that's fine. But if you can't write a good tune, you're not going to do well in game composition. So here's some necessary skills. 1, you need to learn how to compose. Okay, so Captain Obvious, right? But what exactly does composition entail? Composition entails you need to learn how to write a good melody. Not only do you need to learn how to write a good melody, and I'm going to give you some tactics for how to do this. I'm not just going to leave you in the deep end here. I'm not going to leave you in the lurch. I'm going to help you out. But I just want to give you a primer here. All right, so first off, you need to understand intervals. You need to understand how they work. You need to understand what they sound like. You need to train your ear to understand the particular emotions that particular intervals have. That's very important. And I'm going to put all the resources that I possibly can on this page for you to utilize. I could not possibly dive into this topic here. It would take another 3-hour lecture just to talk about melody and intervals, but I'm going to put all the resources for everything I'm talking about in the description of the video or on this page, so feel free to definitely check those out. You need to understand melodic contour. Number 2, melodic contour is how melodies move up or down, or how they and what that makes you feel. For example, consider the song Joy to the World. It's Christmas time as I'm recording this, so this is fresh in my mind, but you think about Joy to the World. Joy to the world, the Lord is come. That's a descending contour. Let earth receive her King. That's an ascending contour. So you need to understand how the contour of a melody affects its singability, how it affects the emotions that the player is feeling, etc., etc. Which of course leads me to singability. Singability is crucial, I believe, for melodies when you're starting out. When someone can sing a melody or hum it in the shower, that's just much higher likelihood that it's going to get stuck in their head. It's going to become an earworm. And that's probably what most composers are going for. Unless you're specifically not going for a singable melody, I would recommend trying to sing your melodies as you write them so that anybody can sing them. Next, you need to learn harmony. Harmony is a huge topic. I would recommend starting with this, learning functional harmony. Each chord in a particular scale has a particular job. Some chords are meant to feel at home and restful. Those are the tonic chords. Some chords are meant to feel tense, like they need a resolution. Those are the dominant chords. Then there's the chords in between called the predominant or subdominant chords. This is very important. Almost all Western music, including video game music, can be broken down into functional harmony. There is such thing as non-functional harmony, but just getting the basics of functional harmony down will serve you very well and get you out of a lot of harmonic pickles. 2, I recommend learning jazz harmony. Jazz harmony is very ubiquitous all over video game music. Jazz harmonies everywhere, especially Japanese video game music. They are heavily influenced by jazz, more so than the Western world, I would even say. Jazz is huge, starting with the 2-5-1 progression and just moving on to other things. Learning the basics of jazz harmony is going to serve you very well. Modes and scales. Video game music is very modal. What do I mean by that? We'll learn modes and scales maybe in another course. I would love to do a course all about modes. They're super fascinating to me, just the emotions behind modes. Modes, if you don't know what they are, they're basically major and minor scales with altered pitches that create different sorts of emotions. Video game music is highly modal. There's modes all over video game music. It's very helpful for creating certain emotions in games. You don't hear a lot of modes in pop music. There's some, but not a lot. But there's tons of modal usage in video game music. So that's going to be a skill that you're definitely going to want to learn, and I'll put resources in the description. You are going to want to live, breathe, and sleep leitmotifs. Okay, what is a leitmotif? Many of you have probably heard this. You've probably at least heard the word motif, so you can probably guess what this is. If you don't know what a leitmotif is, it is a short, constantly recurring musical phrase associated with a particular person, place, or idea. It is very, very prevalent in film music. Think Star Wars. Luke's theme, the Force theme, the Imperial March. Every time Darth Vader's on screen, dun 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 dun. You know, very common. No matter what scenario he's in, that music plays. Your brain associates that theme with Darth Vader. Well, video games use leitmotifs a lot. They're all over the place in games. So let's take a look at a few real-life examples of leitmotifs in games. Here is a fantastic example of leitmotifs in a whole series, and that is the Legend of Zelda series, in particular, Kakariko Village. We're first introduced to this melody in the Super Nintendo Zelda A Link to the Past. Then brought back in a slightly different arrangement in The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time for the N64. And here's the really interesting part. When we move to the GameCube and we go to Zelda Wind Waker, there is no Kakariko Village. However, there is an island in the game that functions like Kakariko Village. It's a friendly village sort of hub where people congregate, where you can get side quests, where you can explore, that sort of thing. And listen very closely to this theme and the little callback they have to Kakariko Village right here. There are also scenarios in which an entire game's soundtrack is built around a single leitmotif. For example, take Super Mario 64. This is a classic theme, you've probably heard this. Take a listen to the main theme. Now listen to the Snow Levels theme. And the athletic version of the theme. Does anything sound familiar? This little motif is morphed and developed and used as the basis for every single one of these level themes. Not only that, but it also makes its way into the very first piece of music you hear in the game when Mario is being introduced. And it plays whenever you get a star.
Here we go!
You know you've succeeded as a composer when the player is playing through a level and they already know the melody, but they have never heard the song before. And you're thinking to yourself, how the heck do I know this? It's because the composer has taken a leitmotif, a very simple one at that, and has expanded it and developed it to be the basis of the entire soundtrack. So what are the benefits of leitmotifs? One, let's just be honest, you don't need to write as much musical material. You can take one melody, one harmonic idea, one riff, and you can expand it out. You can develop it. You can morph it. You can build onto it. You can strip it down away. You can make it bare bones. You can make it super orchestrated. There's so many possibilities. The best thing is that all those possibilities can be created from one small musical idea. The second benefit to leitmotifs is that they offer players a sense of familiarity with while still being different, right? So it's kind of like what I said. It's kind of like what I said about the Super Mario 64 example. You hear that melody and it's familiar. It feels comfortable. It's comforting to the player because it's so familiar, yet at the same time, it's not stale or boring because it's presented and developed in a different way. And the third big benefit is what I alluded to just now, is that motifs can be morphed, they can be developed, they can be manipulated to great effect, both from an immersion standpoint, a design standpoint, and an emotional standpoint. All right. Another skill that composers must know is that of arrangement. So, what is arrangement? It's tough to get a concrete definition of arrangement, but here is one that I really like. Arrangement is the art of giving an existing melody musical variety. So what does that mean? What all is encompassed in the art of arrangement? Let's talk about that. The first thing is orchestration. So I don't want you to think automatically violins and violas and trumpets and trombones and timpanis. That's not exactly what I mean by orchestration. Orchestration is more broad than that. Orchestration simply means assigning instruments to particular musical ideas. So for example, is your melody played by a retro vintage synth? Is it played by a violin? Is it played by a whole violin section? Is it played by the human voice? Is it played by something else entirely? That is orchestration, deciding the instrumentation of how you present your musical idea. Second part of arrangement is transitions. How do you get from one section to the next? How do you connect two musical ideas to make them seem like they're part of the same piece, the same composition, the same universe? The third sub-skill within arrangement is modulation. So modulations are key changes, basically. So how the piece morphs, evolves. Modulations evoke emotion. They can function as design. Modulations definitely evoke Modulations have the potential to create a lot of emotional weight. Structure. Modulations have the potential of creating a lot of emotional weight when they're done well. Next up is structure. Structure is so important. And we're going to talk about that in the next couple slides. But structure is just the whole construction of your piece. If you think about it, kind of like a sandwich, it's the bread, it's the meat, and then it's the other bread on the other side. If you think of it like an essay, it's the beginning, middle, and end. It's basically the entire skeletal construction, the scaffolding of your piece. And we'll talk about that in a second. Dynamics. Dynamics are basically loudness and softness. That's all it is. And a good arranger will have a very dynamic piece of music. Dynamics keep things interesting. When you have a piece at the same dynamics throughout the entire piece, it can get very stale, whether that's totally loud all the time or totally quiet all the time. Most great pieces of music have quiet parts and loud parts. And then there's energy. Now, energy does not necessarily mean volume. Sometimes the two can be conflated. And sometimes the two are hand in hand, but not always. For example, you can have a very low volume but high energy passage of music. And you can have a very high volume but low energy passage of music. Next up is introductions and endings, just what it sounds like. Oftentimes, you don't just want to launch right into the core melody and harmony of a piece. There's introductions, there's build-ups, things like that. And there's also endings. How are you going to end the piece? If it's a piece that requires an ending, how are you going to end it? Is it a loop? Is it something where it actually has a definitive ending? Is it going to end like a fade out? Is it going to have a stinger? That sort of thing. Those are all arrangement decisions. Frequency balance. This is so important. We're going to talk about this. This is basically giving space on the frequency spectrum for your different instruments and parts and all of the sounds that they make, and making sure that the bass or the mids or the highs are not muddy, that you're spreading your instruments out along the frequency spectrum. And we're going to talk about that in the next couple slides. But first, let's talk about structure. Tell me if you've ever been in this situation. So you make an 8-bar loop. Maybe you have a really catchy melody and you just start stacking things on top of it. So you have some really banging drums, you have a cool bass line, you have some synthesized effects, you have all this stuff, and you create this really dense 8-bar loop. But you don't know where to go from there. You kind of get stuck in just this repeating 8-bar loop. You don't know how to expand the idea, you don't know how to develop it, you don't know how to begin or end it. These are problems that are solved by having a good grasp of structure. So this here is a transcription of the Chrono Trigger theme by Yasunori Mitsuda. I'll go ahead and play that now to remind you guys. Great, and this is kindly provided by 8-Bit Music Theory. It's from a presentation that we did at VGM Con last year, just before COVID actually, when the world was normal. So anyway, I want to talk a little bit about structure. So you can see these things are labeled A, B, C. So a good analogy is to think about, if you ever took chemistry in high school or middle school, you think about molecules, atoms, and protons and neutrons. So if you remember back to chemistry, protons and neutrons and electrons are the smallest units, and they make up atoms. And atoms are the next largest unit, and when they're bunched together, they make up molecules. If you're an actual chemist, you're probably like dying right now, but this is how I remember it. So each of these sections here, this A section, this A section, this B section, you can think of these as like the molecules of the piece. They're the largest sort of constructed elements of the piece, not like chemistry elements, like they're the largest constructed units of the piece. So you can look at this A section, and this A section is basically identical to this A section. Same notes, same phrases, everything. And then you have this B section, which takes a huge turn. It's totally different. And then you have a C section, which is different from all the B section and the A section together. So this can be seen as kind of the molecule. So when you're looking at a piece, you need to train yourself to start seeing this stuff. To not just see all these confusing notes and chord symbols and things like that, but when you're writing and when you're composing and when you're analyzing a piece, whatever it may be, think in structure, think in sections. So like, okay, don't think, okay, this is an 8-bar or 16-bar loop or 32-bar loop. It's like, no, okay, this is the A section, and we're communicating something in the A section. Then we transition to the B section, and the B section is communicating something different. Then we go to the C section, and maybe even a D section, and then back to the A section. When you start to see music this way, it's very helpful. Okay, so we talked about how we have our molecules, which are the biggest. Those are made up of atoms, okay? So these are like the atoms, okay? A-T-O-M-S, not atom like, Adam Lambert or something. Atoms, okay? So this phrase right here is the exact same as this phrase right here. Now these are called phrases because they're not quite big enough to be full sections, but they're definitely not small enough to just be like notes. They're obviously a collection of notes, and we call them phrases. So these two phrases are the same, which is why I've colored them as such, and these two phrases are the same. So now we're starting to break things down. Things are becoming a lot less overwhelming and a lot more manageable. We're starting to see our music in sections, A, B, C. Then when we look into the sections, we're starting to see phrases. Okay, so things are getting much more manageable. Then on top of that, of course, the atoms are made up of the protons, neutrons, and electrons, and these are the individual notes. Now, why is this helpful? If I need to sit down and I say, okay, I need to write a 90-minute, that would be epic, a 90-second loop for a piece of music. I'm going to look and I'm going to say, okay, I want to have an A section, a repeating A section, a B section, and a C section. Boom. That's taken care of. That's given me a clear blueprint of how much music I need to write. Okay. So then I have my boundaries. I have my boundary points. I have the starting boundary and the ending boundary. So I already feel better. I already feel more comfortable. Next, I need to say, okay, so I have my sections lined up. I'm going to say, you know, this is X many bars, this is X many bars, this is X many measures, etc. Okay, what are the phrases that are going to compose my sections? So now we're thinking in terms of atoms. So we're saying, okay, so probably gonna have this phrase, and then, you know, maybe we'll have a second phrase, and then we'll repeat the first phrase, and then the second phrase. Okay, so then I gotta write my phrases. Okay, well, what notes do I want in my phrases? Okay, so you see how much manageable that becomes? Instead of saying like, okay, I gotta write a whole composition, now we're breaking things down by section, and then we're saying, okay, now I just need to write a single phrase. And then in that phrase, I just need to write like just a couple notes to make up this phrase. It makes things way more manageable, and it breaks you out of that 8-bar trap. So that is just some thoughts that I have on structure. Very important concept to understand. Next, let's talk about frequency balance. This is another super important aspect of arrangement. Okay, so I found this chart, stole it off the internet. So if you look at this chart here, you can see we have the instruments here, we have the piano here, but what I really want you to pay attention to, okay, is this section right here. Okay, so this section here, you can see it's marking off, it's delineating these sections on the piano. So we have our sub-bass frequencies. This is anything from this E down, okay? Really, really close to the range of human hearing, more stuff you can feel rather than hear. Then you have your bass, okay? This is where a lot of kick drums, bass guitars, some deep synths, maybe even some like really, really low male voices. Like my voice, I'm a baritone, so I'm a pretty low singer. So my voice can hang out somewhere around here, from here to around here. So then you have the upper bass band. Okay, so here you might have things like the strumming of an acoustic guitar, or you might have, you know, a particular synthesizer sound that kind of sticks out right around here. Lots of orchestral instruments are going to be here. Then you have your low mid-range, your mid-range, etc., etc. I'm not going to belabor the point. The point of me pointing all that out is that you want to make sure not only your instruments are spread across these sections, but the parts that you play are spread across these sections. For example, if you have your bass playing here, your kick drum also playing here, and then a synthesizer part playing here, that is going to sound crazy muddy, okay? If you have a synthesizer part playing here, or let's move to the orchestral side. Let's say you have a cello or some strings playing here, and then you have a French horn harmony happening here, and then you have a counter melody in the clarinets happening here, and then you have you know, a bunch of other things happening here. This is going to sound crazy muddy. So yes, you can fix this by EQ. The mixers among you, the people who know this, you can fix this with EQ. However, a better way forward is to just pick your instruments and your parts in a way that spreads them across the keyboard, spreads them across these ranges. Why? Because then you might not even need EQ. Honestly, if you have all of your parts and they're all assigned to these particular sections and they're all playing their own role in creating this very, very full sound across the spectrum of the piano or the spectrum of human hearing, you sometimes don't even need to do a lot of EQ. So that's going to save you a ton of time. And if there's one thing that I think people mean when they say, I want to get good at arrangement, I think this is what they mean, is frequency balancing their instruments across the frequency spectrum. All right, so let's talk about production. So production, what is production? Here's some production skills you're going to need to know. Number one is you're going to need to know how to record. Duh. You're going to need to know how to record tracks. You're going to need to know how to navigate your DAW. You're going to need to know how to record live if you ever want to do that with a microphone. You're going to need to know how to manipulate, duplicate, cut, edit tracks. This is all stuff, the basic stuff that you'll learn, you know, reading the first couple pages of the manual of your DAW. You're going to need to know how to use VSTs. Now, this does not mean that I want you to go out and buy a bunch of VSTs. The exact opposite. I want you to download free VSTs and use the mixing VSTs that came with your DAW and master those first before you go out and buy a bunch of VSTs. I do not want to be responsible for anybody going into debt. You do not need to go into debt to make great video game music, but you do need to master your VSTs. This might mean reading the manual. This might mean watching some tutorial videos, but you need to know your way around a couple VST instruments. I would highly recommend learning synthesis. You don't need to be Disasterpeace. You don't need to be writing like, Fez or Hyper Light Drifter soundtrack. You don't need to be Skrillex or whoever the kids are listening to these days. I don't know. But it is very helpful to know what an ADSR envelope is. Do you know what an ADSR envelope is? A lot of plugins use that. Do you know what a low frequency oscillator is? Okay. Do you know these terms? Like if a plugin were to load up and you were forced to try to navigate that, would you just be randomly clicking buttons and turning knobs, or would you kind of know what you're doing? So understanding the basics of synthesis and how synthetic sound is created and modulated is an important skill. And I'll post a really, really great resource that I learned from in the resource part of this presentation. It's like the super old, hilarious tutorial series that looks like it was filmed on a potato, but it's amazing. You're going to want to learn samples. What are samples? Samples are just little bits of sound. That's all they are. But there's a thing called a sampler. A sampler is something that plays back samples. It can manipulate samples. It can pitch shift samples. It can assign samples to certain keys on your MIDI keyboard. Understanding how samples work and how samplers work is also very important in terms of production. All right, mixing. Whew, okay. Mixing is a massive topic. It's very, very easy to get lost in the rabbit trail of mixing. Mixing engineers and mastering engineers spend years and years and years perfecting this. I'm not talking about writing music. I'm not even talking about composing. I'm not talking about even producing music. I'm talking about just the art of mixing. You can spend decades learning this, okay? So it's a rabbit trail, okay? But as a game composer, you are going to be expected to mix your own music unless you want to hire someone, which can get very expensive. But the good news is this: you really only need to master the fundamentals. I am not, by any stretch of the imagination, an expert mixer. However, I have mixed my own albums before, and I've mixed lots of different kinds of music before, and I've spent a ton of time doing research, and I can tell you that the most important mixing skills you need to know are the following. You need to know how to gain stage. You need to know that all this means is how much gain are you sending in to your signal chain? How much gain are you sending in to your audio interface? How much gain are you sending into your plugins? Are you clipping anywhere in your plugins? Are you clipping on your master fader? Are you giving yourself plenty of headroom? And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'm going to post resources here. I definitely recommend you check those out. Volume balancing. This, my friends, volume balancing is 90, maybe not 90, 85 to 80, 80%. 80% of mixing is getting a good volume balance. I recommend mixers, people who are mixing their own music, spend at least 75 to 80% of their time just getting a good volume balance. If you do a bunch of effects and you do compression and EQ and saturation and distortion and de-essing and all these fancy effects, but you don't have a good volume balance, it will mean almost nothing. Get a good volume balance first, and a lot of these other things will simply fall into place. The next, we're going to talk about frequency balancing. So now we're talking about EQ. So I've mentioned that word a few times. If you don't know what an EQ is, the simplest way to explain it is this. You know how you can turn the volume up and down, obviously, on your whole composition? The EQ is like turning the volume up and down on specific frequencies. So like turning the volume up and down on the bass, turning the volume up and down on the mids, stuff like that. That's EQ. Really important to use EQ to get rid of resonance and nasty room sounds if you're recording acoustic stuff. A lot of VSTs, like synthesized stuff, are pre-EQ'd, so you don't need to do a whole lot of EQ. It can be done for like dramatic effect, like filter sweeps. It can also be done to carve out certain areas of the frequency spectrum, kind of like what I showed you on that piano diagram. You can do that with EQ as well. Then there's dynamics balancing. Dynamics is basically compression. So compression is essentially just the art and craft of taking the really, really loud parts and making them quieter, and taking the really, really quiet parts and making them louder. And there's lots of different ways that you can go about that, but that's the basics of dynamics balance. And that is what compression compressors and limiters and de-essers do. Automation. Automation is the secret sauce, my friends. Automation is basically changing all of these parameters over time, changing your volume over time, maybe changing your compression over time, maybe changing reverb and delay over time. Automation is the thing that really makes a track come to life. All right, so let's talk about musical genres. So when I was writing this presentation, I really tried hard to put video game music into these neat little boxes so that I could tell you this is exactly what an action game sounds like. This is exactly what a platformer sounds like, or a racing game. But honestly, I can't do that. I can't do that to you guys because games take on so many different styles that it's impossible. It's impossible to categorize them that way. I thought through a few of my favorite game soundtracks and what kind of genres you might classify them as, just to show you this point. Super Mario Odyssey has almost every single genre under the sun, from nods to Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker mixed with Nightmare Before Christmas, to bouncy, synth-based electronic music in the special stages, to literal surf rock drum and bass in Steam Gardens. So you get the point. None of these things can really be neatly put into a box. So what are composers to do? How do you master these quote-unquote genres? Well, I want to tell you a story. Andrew Huang, many of you will probably know him if you follow YouTubers who do music. He is a very, very prolific music YouTuber, does a lot of synthesized stuff. He had this story, and I don't remember where the video was, but he basically said, you know, when I was breaking into music, a client would say, hey, can you write flamenco music? And some super niche sort of genre, and he would just say, yeah, absolutely. Of course, the problem was he had no idea how to write flamenco music, but he would learn anyway. So obviously you need to know your limits, okay? If this is something that you're woefully underqualified for, then yeah, don't say yes to just like, yeah, I'm gonna write a Firebird suite with, you know, free orchestral plugins. Yeah, that's not gonna happen. But if it's within your power, say yes and then figure it out later. For example, Siberian, the developers came to me, they said, hey, we want an authentic Sega Genesis chiptune. Okay, totally authentic, written in a tracker. I have never used a tracker before, but I said yes, because I was like, you know what? I'm willing to learn. I believe in myself. I think I can do this. And I did. And I learned the tracker and I wrote the soundtrack, and I think it turned out pretty good. Second is to listen to a ton of music. I hope you all have Spotify and Spotify Discover Weekly. One of the best ways to discover new music is the Discover Weekly thing on Spotify. It's introduced me to so many different genres, and I don't just mean video game music. Please, video game music should be like 10 to 15% of what you listen to. Listen to pop, listen to synthwave, listen to jazz, listen to world, listen to classical, listen to folk, listen to rap, listen to R&B, listen to all these different genres, because video game composers derive their music from these genres anyway. So you might as well go straight to the source. And that kind of goes hand in hand with learning a spectrum of styles. The more styles you learn, the closer you'll get to finding your own voice. Now here's some common sound palettes that you might want to write music in, or that you might be asked to write music in. The first is what I would just call retro. And this is chiptune. This is 8-bit music, 16-bit music like on the Sega Genesis, 32-bit music, or like N64 style, really, really compressed samples. Then you have synthetic music, which I would call things like pads, synths, samples, drum machines, things that like don't exist in real life. They're simply sounds that are synthetically generated. Then you have modern instruments, which it's maybe not the best designation, but I would say quote unquote real instruments, like things that you would find on a rock stage, like guitars, acoustic drums, electric guitars, bass guitars, Rhodes keyboards, things like that. Then you have orchestral music. Now, orchestral can comprise a lot of different subgenres, things like string, wind, brass, quartets, or quintets. You have small chamber ensembles, full orchestra, or you can do like a hybrid situation like Hans Zimmer does, where he mixes orchestral music with more synthetic elements. Now, you don't need to know all of these palettes. It's good to just start with one. Learn everything you can about retro music, or grab a synthesizer and just start making some synthwave or synthetic hyperlight drifter ambient type stuff, or if you're a guitarist or a drummer, lean into that. Use real instruments, use real drums, record real drums, or find a nice sample library of real drums or acoustic guitars, that sort of thing. I think game music definitely has a lot of space for those real instruments. So don't get overwhelmed. Just start with one sound palette, learn everything you can about it. Let's talk about some VSTs. I recommend Native Instruments Complete. That's what you see here on the screen. Native Instruments Complete is pretty much like foundational level, everything you'll ever need for any genre. Now, that's not to say that you'll want to add. You'll definitely want to supplement this with other things, especially orchestral. If you want to write orchestral music, I would not recommend Native Instruments Complete. But just about every other genre of music, man, this is just so comprehensive. I mean, you have world music like West African and Indian instruments. You have plugins, really nice plugins. You have acoustic drums, acoustic guitar, electric piano. It's got Massive, which is one of the best synthesizers ever made. It's got Kontakt, which is probably the best synthesizer, or excuse me, the best sampler ever made. It's got all these really interesting sound morphing plugins, organic sounds, synthetic sounds, modern sounds. It's just really, really good, especially if you're just starting out. I bought it, and though I have admittedly not used every plugin within it, I have definitely got my money's worth with how many sounds are available at my disposal. Super Audio Cart is a VST plugin that replicates 8-bit sound palettes, 16-bit, 32-bit, like NES, Game Boy, Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, and you can even mix them together, so you can blend these sounds together for a really kind of interesting hybrid chiptune sound. It's not going to be as authentic as actually composing in a tracker, but it's very cool and very creative and can make some really interesting soundscapes for that retro sound palette. For mixing, I really like the Waves Gold suite. If you've mastered and if you've maxed out, again, I can't stress this enough. If you've maxed out your free mixing plugins and you're looking for some mixing plugins, I really like the Wave Gold suite. VST Buzz is a great site. There's tons. You can sign up for their newsletter. There's tons of free VSTs or super cheap ones. So definitely check out VST Buzz. And then I really like Spitfire for orchestral stuff. I know people have different opinions on orchestral. You're going to want to do lots of research before you buy orchestral sample libraries. I just love Spitfire. I love their brand. I love their, how they educate. They care so much about education on YouTube, all the investments that they made into, their audience for investing in them and educating them, putting out tons of free content on YouTube. I love their labs instruments. I just feel a lot of loyalty to Spitfire, and they just make a very quality and very expensive product. So definitely look out for Black Friday sales if you want to go the orchestral route. All right, so already we have covered a ton of stuff. We've talked about technology. We've talked about the craft of composition. We've talked about arrangement, and you might be sitting there totally overwhelmed thinking, how in the heck am I supposed to improve all of these skills? Well, as you can read on the screen, I kind of have an idea about that. Transcribing and analyzing and studying music is not the only way to improve, but it is by far the most effective way to improve. Hands down, I will die on that hill. Don't at me. And I mean, it is the best way to improve at everything we just talked about, everything I just mentioned. It's so effective. It's the closest thing to having a superpower in the world of composition that you can get. It's the closest thing to cheating. So I get questions on how to improve all the time. How do I write better arrangements? How do I write better transitions? How do I write longer compositions? How do I write B sections? How do I write music that I hear in my ear? And these are all valid questions, and the answer is always the same. Transcribe and analyze the music that you want to sound like. Now, people don't like this answer. Okay, people do not like this answer because it requires work. It is hard work to transcribe and analyze music. And as humans, we naturally want the path of least resistance. Just give me the book, give me the blog post, give me the video, give me the course, give me the silver bullet that I need to learn music. Well, this is the silver bullet. If you want to get good at basketball, you go outside every day, you work on your fundamentals, dribbling, passing, shooting. There's no secret formula. There's no silver bullet. It's just mastering the fundamentals and the basics by analyzing other people's music. Now, it is hard work, but I'm not going to leave you in the lurch. I'm going to show you exactly how to transcribe and analyze music over the course of the next couple dozen slides or so, probably next dozen slides. And it's helpful to say that I didn't always feel this way. There were actually two really insightful moments that opened my eyes to this truth, to this reality, frankly. The first was with 8-Bit Music Theory. He was, I believe, the third guest on the podcast. I interviewed him several years ago. We've become really good friends since then. But when we first spoke, he said this thing that I always quote whenever I discuss this particular topic. He said, "The difference between plagiarism and writing a great song is that instead of stealing from one song, you steal from 6. And that kind of makes you uncomfortable, right? I mean, that made me a little uncomfortable. I wasn't so sure about that. I'm an artist, right? I want to have my own voice. Don't you hear people say that? You might feel the same way. I want to have my own voice. I want to be my own artist. I want to have my own sound. I want to carve my own sonic niche. Well, the ironic thing is that the more you steal, the more original your sound becomes. Again, I'll say that. The more you steal, the more original your sound becomes. I know it sounds crazy, but this book absolutely confirmed it for me. So everybody knows, or at least most people probably know, the famous quote, "Good artists borrow, great artists steal," by Pablo Picasso. Well, this book expounds on that idea and takes it to a whole new level, and it demonstrates just how many creatives in history. I mean, it blew my mind when he went through all the creatives in history that simply are the result of all of their copied influences. You know, it's easy to believe that the heroes of VGM are your favorite video game composer, whether that's Koji Kondo, I keep using him as an example because he's obviously my favorite, or any other composer just sort of descended from heaven writing these beautiful melodies and harmonies. But the bottom line is that they didn't. They were and are heavily influenced by the music that they played and learned as young musicians. If you want to learn more about that, I'm not going to make a full argument for this. I highly recommend you check out this book. It's a short book. You can bang it out in a weekend, but it absolutely changed the way I see making art. So let's talk a little bit about how to analyze a track. For the sake of argument, I'm just going to say I've convinced you. Okay, you're ready. You're ready to analyze music. I've convinced you that this is the way forward to improvement. There are lots of ways to analyze a track, ranging from more low effort to extremely high effort. So let's take a look at a few of those now. The first is critical listening. Now, critical listening is exactly what it sounds like. It's sitting down, undistracted, preferably with a nice pair of studio monitors or some nice headphones, putting them on and just listening through a piece with an extremely intent ear. It's the equivalent of running a piece of music through your brain with a fine-tooth comb, I guess you might say. So you might listen through multiple times and say, okay, the first time I'm going to listen to just the melody, okay, and then I'm going to listen again, and I'm going to listen to just the harmony, okay, then I'm going to listen again, and I'm going to listen to just the drums, and I'll listen again, I'm going to listen to just the bass, and I'm going to listen again, I'm going to listen to just the production, and then I'm going to listen again, I'm going to see if there's any background elements that I'm missing, like, you know, synth parts or counter melodies that are like sort of tucked into the mix in the background. Now, you will be shocked at how far just mastering this skill will take you in analyzing and creating music. You will hear things that you never thought you would hear, and it will give you awesome ideas for your compositions. And of course, I do this first because this is essential. This is the foundation to all other ways of analysis. You need to learn how to critically listen to music. The next thing is a cheat sheet. And I call this a cheat sheet. Before, I've called this sort of a quick and dirty transcription. Cheat sheet is basically you just open up a notepad or a Google Doc, and it's just a total stream of conscience notation of what you're hearing, the structure, anything else. It's kind of like a transcription in a hurry. So you might write, song opens up with a drum intro, then goes into synth, then goes into a 2-5-1 pattern with this chord, and then it's just total stream of conscience. It's basically writing down everything you're hearing in the critical listening phase. So the next thing, and this is definitely part of transcription, I would consider this part of transcription. Some people skip this step. I don't think you should skip this step. I think this is super valuable. And that's to learn the song on your instrument. Now, I'm presuming the people watching this play an instrument. If you don't, obviously this doesn't apply to you, although I highly recommend learning an instrument. But whether you play piano or guitar or saxophone or some other orchestral instrument or even drums or percussion, I would highly recommend learning the song on your instrument. This goes a long way. Musicians call this getting the song under your fingers. It really shows you, especially if you play it on a piano. I really like learning songs on a piano. Even though I'm a guitarist first, I like learning songs on the piano because I can see laid out on the keyboard what's happening, and it really helps me wrap my head conceptually around what's happening in the song. So I do recommend that. The lead sheet, and I'll explain what that little plus means in a second, a lead sheet transcription. We'll talk more about that. I'm going to save that for the next few slides. A Roman numeral analysis, I'm going to also go into depth on that, and a full score transcription. Now, the ultimate sort of galaxy brain move. This takes a really, really long time, but if you really want to learn like everything, top to bottom, remake the track. Yes, actually try your best to replicate the track exactly in your DAW. And if you're like shaking your head like, dude, that's impossible, it's not impossible, but it is hard. But dude, you will learn so much remaking tracks. I mean, it is incredible how quickly you will improve if you try to remake a track. You will fail, and it will be hard, and some things will sound crappy, and you'll run into walls, and it'll get frustrating, but I cannot recommend that. At least remake one track in your life. Try to remake one track, and I think that you will agree with me on the other side of that effort, in that it is one of the best things you can do for your transcription, analysis, and composition skills. So let's look at these in detail. So this is a lead sheet, once again, generously provided by my friend 8-Bit Music Theory from a previous presentation, and it's the main theme from Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. So I like to think of lead sheets as the essential information of a piece, such that you could just give this, theoretically, to a talented sight reader, and they could just play it, even if they'd never heard the song before, with little trouble. So the cool thing about lead sheets is that they can be done fairly quickly, because if you see here, lead sheets just contain the melody, so you don't need to notate any sort of bass or harmony parts. It's just a simple melody, as well as the chords. So you can do Roman numeral analysis, as well as the structure. So you can do a structural analysis. So it just gives you the skeleton of the piece. We're not worried about assigning instruments. We're not worried about notating the inner voices. We're not trying to do counterpoint or figure out what the bass is doing. We just want to get the melody and the chords. And just by doing that, you can learn a ton. Now, before I talk about the lead sheet plus, I want to talk about what exactly a Roman numeral analysis is. So Roman numeral analysis is essentially taking all of the degrees of a given scale. So let's take the major scale, for example, here. So the scale is broken up into scale degrees. So the first degree of the major scale is the major 1. Then we have the minor 2, the minor 3, the major 4, the major 5, the minor 6, and the diminished 7th. Those are the degrees. If you were to build triads on each tone of the major scale, those are the degrees of the scale. You also have the natural minor, melodic minor, harmonic minor. We won't worry about that for this particular demonstration. So what Roman numeral analysis entails is actually going through and taking all of the chords of a lead sheet or a given score. I took a picture of this. This was a score that I transcribed and did a Roman numeral analysis on when I was preparing for my role on Siberian as composer. This was a huge influence for the developer, so I transcribed this and I did a Roman numeral analysis. So you can see I'm taking each chord and I am basically writing a Roman numeral that corresponds to that scale degree, and you can see there's some Roman numerals up here as well. So there's lots of benefits to doing this. You might be asking yourself, well, why the heck would I do this? There are lots of benefits to Roman numeral analyses. Number one is it breaks down the patterns, progressions, and themes of a piece independent of keys. So a 2-5-1 or a 3-6-2-5-1 is going to be the same no matter what key it's in. Sometimes we get distracted by the keys, but when we see these progressions and patterns independent of keys, notated as Roman numerals, it gives us clarity and helps us to understand where things are repeating. It expresses the function of a chord or a set of chords rather than just what the literal chord is. So that kind of goes back to learning functional harmony. The 5 chord always wants to go back to the 1 chord. Well, notice I'm using language expressed in numbers. I'm saying 5 and 1 and 2, 5, 1. These are all things that you would not be able to know unless you do a Roman numeral analysis. So doing a Roman numeral analysis really kind of opens your eyes to like how the piece is functioning and how the harmony is driving the momentum of the piece forward. And of course, a really great benefit is that it helps you, the composer, build a repository of patterns and cliches that then you can use in your own compositions. So let's talk about the next level, Lead Sheet Plus. I call this Lead Sheet Plus because it's still kind of a lead sheet. The only addition is that we're now notating the bass as well. The reason we do this is because you can see these slash chords. This means that the upper harmony is playing one chord and the bass is playing another. This is important information for us as composers because we can see what kind of effect this is happening on the overall emotion behind the composition. And really the best way to know that is to have a bass transcription here in the bass clef. So this helps us not only see what the bass is doing against the harmony and the melody, but it gives us bass rhythm as well. So this is kind of the next step beyond a lead sheet. Next, after the Lead Sheet Plus, is what I would call the full transcription. Now, the full transcription is not only do we have bass, not only do we have melody, we have everything the previous ones had, but now we also have these inner harmonic voices. So now we're noticing what the harmony, the inner voices. So we have the bass, it's kind of like a sandwich, right? You have the melody, which is kind of like the bread on top. You have the bass, which is kind of like the bread in the middle. And now we have the meat, which is the harmony. And so we can see exactly the rhythm of the harmony and what it's doing throughout the piece. The key to the full transcription is you want to try your best to keep all the information down to a grand staff. A grand staff is just one treble clef and one bass clef. Now let's say you want to go a step further. This is the final form of the transcription here. This is the full score. So now in the full score, we are not only transcribing everything we hear in the music, we're also taking the transcription and we're assigning instruments to it. So you can see we have the horn and F, the snare drum, the strings, the flute, etc. Now, why on earth would you do this? This is really hard work. Number one, this is going to train your ear like crazy. You will be exhausted after you do a full score, but your ear, it'll be like basically going to the gym and just doing like a full day's workout on your ear. Like you will improve so much, but you will be exhausted. It is by far the most effective way to learn arrangement principles. Why? Because now all of a sudden I'm looking at this and I'm saying, oh, interesting. The snare drum is playing this kind of marching rhythm, and that's going up against this really interesting pizzicato rhythm in the bass, and then whoa, we have this rhythm on the strings. That's interesting. Oh, and what is this? These strings are voiced in fourths. Okay, that's really interesting. And then you go over here and you say, okay, and so you're basically okay. So I see the flute is playing in almost an octave above, and so you're soaking all this in like a sponge. I haven't even done a full analysis. I'm just noticing these things by looking at it, and this gives you just a treasure trove of ideas of how then you can take these rhythms and how you can take this voicing of, okay, now maybe I'll voice my strings in fourths, or okay, now maybe I'll try this pizzicato rhythm. Okay, now maybe I'll try this snare drum rhythm. And it gives you so many ideas for your own compositions. Now, if you're not into sheet music, which I understand many people aren't, well, number one, I would recommend that you get into it because I was not. I basically was, grew up a bluegrass musician. I was raised in just a few miles south of Alabama, and my family growing up, we played bluegrass, and you definitely did not use music when you played bluegrass. You just needed to know like 3 chords pretty much. So I come from a tradition that was not down with sheet music, and I learned it, and it really opened my eyes. I don't believe the dichotomy of, you either are a sheet music musician or you play by ear. You can do both, and it would behoove you to do both because it just makes you that much more valuable as a composer. However, all that said, as a caveat, you can do all of this in your DAW. You can replicate it in your DAW. You can, write all these parts out and basically do it in MIDI. The problem with that is that it's a lot harder to read and interpret a MIDI piano roll than it is to interpret music. This is obviously something that musicians have used for hundreds and hundreds of years, and so it's a pattern that works. So I would recommend, at least for your transcription, getting to know an app like MuseScore or Sibelius if you have that, really at least knowing the basics of sheet music. So let's recap here because I feel like this is super important. If you want to improve at melody, transcribe and study a lead sheet. And I would also add to this, learn the melody on your instrument. If you want to improve at harmony, I would do a lead sheet plus. That way you can see that bass motion. So it gives you some more ideas of how to contrapuntally write your bass parts. If you want to learn arrangement, I absolutely would recommend a full score. It's the best way to learn how different instruments communicate with one another and complement one another. If you want to learn some advanced harmony tricks and you want to start building your repertoire of harmonic patterns and progressions, definitely do a Roman numeral analysis. And last but not least, if you want to learn mixing and you want to learn production, there's really no better way than to remake tracks and use the reference tracks as your anchor and try to get it to sound as close as you possibly can to the reference. You're going to learn so much by doing that. Whew, okay, here we go. So let's talk about the business of game composition. Wow, there is so much to talk about here, and there's no way that I could do it justice, but I'm going to do my best. Okay, here we go. The number one thing you need to know about being successful in the business of game composition is you need to build relationships. You need to build relationships in person. You need to build relationships online. You just need to start building relationships. Join indie game developer groups. Attend game jams. All right, so this is me right here. This was my team. We won second place at the game jam here in Orlando, Florida. It was a space-themed game jam. It was one of the most fun things I've ever done. Shout out to my wife who watched my baby son while I was able to do that. It's definitely not the same when you're, a 30-year-old man, but it was really, really fun. Now I understand, I get it. This is way, way before COVID. However, itch.io, which is why I put that in parentheses, has a lot of digital game jams, which honestly, they're nowhere near the same. It's nowhere near the same level of camaraderie, but it is a great place nonetheless to get together with a group of people to build something, to actually write music for a finished project, and to really just build relationships and have a lot of fun and get a lot of practice in. So I definitely recommend you check out itch.io and join some game jams. I would join local meetups as soon as you feel safe to do so. Hopefully, this is recorded in December of 2020. Hopefully, as things progress here into 2021, things will return to some level of normality. But I would definitely recommend you go to meetup.com and you look for some local game meetups in your area. I'm grateful that I have a really cool one here in Orlando. That's just about 15 minutes from where I live. They haven't been meeting for obvious reasons for a while, but I'm looking forward to going back there. And secondly, you can start a blog or a YouTube channel. So I know this is kind of trite advice, but honestly, I have made so many friends, and I would say that probably all of my game composition opportunities in terms of gigs and contracts and commissions and speaking events have all happened through my podcast, Composer Code. I've met people, and this was a total accident. I didn't set out to like I'm going to use this podcast to network. I was just like, no, I'm just curious and I want to interview these people because I think they're awesome. And so I'd interview these people and we just became friends, and I'd get invited to things, and games and game contracts would get sent my way. And so things just started happening, and I started really making a lot of friends in the space, and it was great. So honestly, I would start a blog or YouTube channel, but don't see it like I'm going to build this massive audience and I'm going to, basically have money raking in. Just think of it as a way to meet people. It's like, hey, I have this YouTube channel where I talk about my favorite game music, or I remake game music, or hey, I have this blog where I talk about some dynamic game music technology, or whatever you're interested in. Sound design, it's just a really great place to attract people to you and meet people. So freelancing is a lot like farming, and you really need to think of it that way. If you want to be a freelancer, you really need to have this mindset where, you might plant a crop, you might plant a seed, you might sow your seed, as they say. And as the old biblical parable says, some is going to fall on rocky soil, some is going to fall on thorny soil, and some is going to fall on good soil. So as you continue to reach out to people, some things are going to pan out. Some things are not going to pan out. Some things are going to take years to pan out. Some things are going to be like, whoa, we met 3 years ago at GDC or a meetup and our composer just dropped out. Do you want to be our composer? I mean, that's a real story that someone on my podcast told me. They met someone and then years later, they followed up with them and said, hey, yeah, our composer dropped out and I remember we met and I liked your stuff. Are you interested? So you have to think of it that way. Success in this business is not going to come overnight. So a few practical strategies. When you're talking with people, don't pitch that you're a composer on the first touch. Don't do that. Composers are notoriously some of the thirstiest people in the games industry. I was talking with a developer and he said this thing that was funny that stuck with me is he said, how do you find 50 composers? And the answer he says was ask for a developer. And what he was alluding to was the fact that anytime any game developer posts that they're working on something or, hey, here's my screenshot or anything like that, they automatically get flooded with very low effort, very obviously desperate messages of, hey, do you need a composer? I'm a composer. I can do this. You want a composer? Now, I just want to be clear. I have nothing wrong with outbound marketing. In fact, I have a slide all about outbound marketing here, but there's a right way and a wrong way to go about this. You would never just meet someone and immediately shake their hand and then give them a business card. I mean, there has to be a relationship there first. So I would say, unless you are feeling it and they specifically ask for your credentials, don't pitch that you're a composer on the first touch. Just say, hey, I ran across your game. This is really cool. I just want to let you know I'm going to be following this on Twitter, maybe even contribute to the Kickstarter. I'm super excited to see what happens. And I just want to say this looks great. The end. That's all you need to say. The number 2 thing is that you always need to be thinking to yourself, what is in it for them? If I'm talking to these composers, if I'm networking, if I'm prospecting with these developers, what value am I adding to them? And every communication that you give them, you want to add them value. This might be doing a free demo track for them. This might be, pointing them in the direction of some resources. This might be doing a really in-depth reply on a forum on something that they're having trouble with. Always think, how can I add value to this conversation? And follow up like crazy. I'll tell you a quick story. So I first got my start as an inside sales rep for a software company, which means I was a cold caller, basically. So that's how I got my start in sales. So I have a background in sales and digital marketing, and I got my background in inside sales. So I'd basically call police officers. Honestly, we sold to police officers, and I was mortified at calling them and following up because I thought, man, they're going to be so annoyed if I call 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. Sometimes we had to call 7 times before we got a hold of someone. Not one single person ever got angry with me for following up. In fact, most of them, just about all of them, were glad I followed up. Oh, I'm so sorry. I got your email. Yeah, oh, thanks so much. Yeah, when can we set up a time to talk? So there's this myth that you're bugging people or that you're annoyed or they're annoyed with you. Most of the time, like I would say 99.9% of the time, they're just busy and your email just gets, tossed away. So if you really are prospecting and you've gotten to this point where you've built a relationship with someone and there's a chance that you might want to be their composer, maybe you send them a free demo track, maybe you send them your demo reel and you guys are having a good conversation, don't be afraid to follow up. Number 4 is to play the long game. Like I said, freelancing is like farming. It takes a long time to reap the crops that you sow. Sometimes these efforts take 2, 3, 4, 5 years to reap the rewards of. So just be patient and be persistent. All right, so I want to talk to you guys about something that is a fairly new strategy on my radar that I think is by far the best way to break into the composition space, and that is to create music packs. This has been proven out by many people close to me, most notably Stephen Malin, who's always on the forefront of game composition trends. So definitely check him out online. He's always the pioneer, right? He's always the first one to test these things out. So basically, game music packs are an excellent way to not only break into the game composition space, not only create some income, but also start creating a name for yourself as a great composer. So like I said, game composition packs on stores like the Unity Asset Store, Game Dev Marketplace, itch.io, you can start generating money right away if your stuff is good enough, because there are constantly developers out there saying like, listen, I just don't have enough money to hire a composer full time. This is my budget on music. I might need to go with something generic. I might just need to go with an asset pack or something like that. So it's very common, and it's a great way to get your foot in the door, because guess what happens when that game is a hit, if it is a hit, and now for their next game, they have double the budget. Who do you think they're going to think of when they want to hire someone for music? That's right. They're going to think of you, and they're going to reach out to you. It is a great inbound strategy. So real quick, I just want to delineate, this is kind of some marketing jargon, but inbound marketing is also called pull marketing. Okay. So that basically means that you just simply exist and people come to you. Inbound is by far the most preferable way to get leads, because you're really not going out to find them. They're coming to you. Okay. So this is a fantastic inbound strategy, because people start coming to you. They start recognizing you as, in this example, the 16-bit action composer. So you might start getting some traffic from the Unity Asset Store. You might start getting some traffic from the Game Dev Marketplace that maybe sends people back to your website. So then there's all this name recognition and inbound pull happening from a music pack. It hones your skills. I mean, honestly, when you're just messing around in your DAW, you find a new plugin, you might make something great, you might make something mediocre, but most of the time you're probably going to make something mediocre. But when you have a deadline, when you have a project, it's like, no, I am going to make this pack and release this to the world. It really forces you to have deadlines. It really forces you to hone your mixing skills, because you have to go through the entire process, the production process, the composition process, the mixing process, the mastering process, the delivery process, the entire life cycle of a piece of music you have to do. And it's great because you can practice this, right? You don't have to do this with the pressure of a developer breathing down your neck of like, hey, when are we going to get those assets? And you're having to figure out all this stuff on your own. This is an excellent way to practice. And the fourth thing is, like I said before, it creates trust and value. How much easier do you think it's going to be for a developer to hire you when they've already used your music pack in a previous game and they absolutely loved it? They're not going to go to another composer. They're going to be like, no, let's stick with what works. Let's go to this guy or gal who made this pack for us, because we know that they can make a quality product. So another way to get into the world of professional composition is to become a composer assistant. Okay, so composer assistant, it's a lot harder to do. It's a lot more challenging. It might require more of a commitment, but it is an absolutely incredible way to get into the field. It teaches you invaluable real-life experience. Most composers' assistants are actually going to be in the studio with composers, watching them over their shoulder, looking at the gear. And a lot of time, from my experience of people who have had a composer internship or been a composer assistant, they are going to even let you do some composing. They're going to let you do maybe some contact programming or some sampling, things of that nature. It builds real relationships. All of a sudden you have an in with a big name composer. I mean, it's a big deal. It's great resume fodder, and I know nobody really uses resumes anymore, but just to have the testimonial of a big name composer on your website goes a long way. And it can be done online. True story. I got a composer assistant job with a composer, and I did everything online. We live in different states. He would send me projects and tasks that needed to be complete, mostly like administrative stuff, some audio editing stuff. I would take care of that. And also, this person referred my very first gig to me, my very first serious game soundtrack he referred to me. So that's a huge deal. Get in through the back door. So this is based on my conversation with Jason Graves. So Jason Graves had a really interesting philosophy on getting into the composition space, which I really appreciate. And that's simply just work in audio. He said, man, trying to become a composer is like trying to become an actor. I mean, that's like hard work. That's like 10 years slogging through the mud, hard work. Just work in audio. Just find a way to get into an adjacent thing to composition. Maybe that's teaching music lessons. Maybe that's editing podcasts. Maybe that's doing voiceover work. Just find something adjacent to compositions, because what happens is you'll start to hang out with a community of audio professionals, and that will inevitably lead to more opportunities in the composition space. All right, so I just talked about inbound marketing. Let's talk a little bit about outbound marketing, cold calling, as I like to say. Now, a lot of people like to poo-poo on cold calling. A lot of people like to poo-poo on outbound marketing for composers. As a matter of fact, I just kind of poo-pooed on it by saying that people are thirsty and that sort of thing. I don't mean to say that you should completely dismiss outbound marketing. It is very valuable. True story. Taylor Ambrosio Wood, one of my first interviews on Composer Code, got her first gig through a random cold call. It was really a cold message or cold email to a developer from a Screenshot Saturday. So it works. It's a numbers game and it's a grind, but I definitely think that it needs to be part of your strategy. So the first step is to follow the hashtag Screenshot Saturdays on Twitter and Facebook, because every Saturday developers all over the world post their games in process. Next is you pitch free demo tracks. And Stephen Malin has a great video on how to do this. You essentially say, hey, I love your game. I want to write for free. And you pitch a free demo track. You wow them with a free demo track. And the third thing is then you set some goals for yourself. So you basically say, okay, I can't control if people say yes. I can't control if people message me back, but I can control how many people I contact. So maybe say, okay, in the month of February, I'm going to reach out to and compose a demo track for 8 developers. That is something that you absolutely can control. And eventually what will happen is you will get traction. And even if they all say no, guess what? You just built yourself a sick demo reel. All right, you need to get your boring documents ready, because one of these days, one of those outbound or inbound leads is actually going to say yes to you, and you're going to be like, holy crap, they're hiring me. What do I do now? Okay, so here's some documents I recommend. Number one is a proposal. A proposal, you can do that in Google Slides, you can do it in PowerPoint. It's basically just a nice slick deck that says, okay, here's who I am, here is what I'm proposing that I write for you, and here's my proposed fee. Okay, it's definitely something that's probably going to go back and forth. There's probably going to be some editing. It has to be professional. It's something that they could just show to their stakeholders or show to, maybe they're a development team and they have a few other people who are in charge of hiring. You want to show them and just say, okay, this is what I'm proposing that I will do. Okay, then once the proposal is agreed upon, then you do a statement of work. Now, a statement of work, I recommend both a statement of work and a contract, because a statement of work is like a less legal contract. A statement of work is basically just saying, okay, we have agreed to this. These are the exact deliverables that I'm going to provide. You sign it. You send it over to them. They sign it. Okay, then you have your contract. Now, your contract is like your multiple document, like 5 to 6 page, totally legalese document that you're going to want to have to make sure that you're protected and that they are protected as well. So you might be asking, okay, why the heck would you do a contract and a statement of work? Well, honestly, this is kind of crazy, but I would find myself referencing the contract as far as my deliverables go, and it just wasn't very efficient because the contract was super like legalese. It's better to reference the statement of work. It's very clear. You can quickly see what your deliverables are, and it's a simpler, easier to read document that both parties can use to see the exact deliverables. All right, let's talk about productivity and workflow. As a freelancer, and even as a composer in general, and just a creative person, it's super important that we impose systems upon ourselves so that we stay productive and we create music as quickly as possible. Here's some productivity systems that I know people use or I have used myself. The first is the Pomodoro technique. So the Pomodoro technique is basically you work for 25 minutes undistracted, take a 5-minute break. That's called a Pomodoro. One of those is called like a Pomo. And then you do that 4 times, 25 minutes undistracted, 5-minute break, 25 minutes undistracted, 5-minute break, 25 minutes. And then on your 4th one, you take a 30-minute break and you just basically repeat that. Really great for people who do intense surges of work, but then want a break. Trello board. This is what is pictured here. Trello boards are really good because they use the Kanban method, which basically you have these categories. Like you might have something like backlog, in progress, mixed, and delivered. And you might have all these columns pertaining to tracks, and then each of these cards pertain to a track. So you take a card, right, and when you write that, you move it over to the written column, and then you move it over to the mixing column, and then you move it over to the delivered column once it's delivered. It just gives you an at-a-glance look at the project. It's a very effective method that Tom Salta swears by. A planning doc and a game design doc is essential. If you don't have one, if the developer doesn't have one, you should insist on making one because it is so helpful for keeping everyone on the same page. Miscommunications are huge, and when everyone's working off the same design doc, it just eliminates that headache altogether. The GTD, or getting things done method, is a great method for basically staying on top of your to-dos. So not keeping what you need to do in your head, but putting it down in a trusted system and getting it done in an efficient way. And I will put some resources on the getting things done method on this page. So here's some tools and software that I like to use for productivity. Number one is just a Google Sheets asset sheet. So this is kind of like taking place of the Pomodoro. So you basically write out all the deliverables. Once you agree on the deliverables, you write on all the deliverables and their due dates in an asset sheet. It's this one single source of truth that you and the developer have access to. So you can both see what needs to be done, what's outstanding, what's been implemented into the game. This is more essential for sound design, I think, when there's tons and tons of sounds that need to be implemented, but it's also a good practice to do for composition. A good old notepad. Notepad on your computer, physical notepad. This is a great tool that you can use to basically keep track of your daily tasks, your weekly tasks, and what's remaining on the project. Todoist is a fantastic to-do app. I've recently switched to TickTick, which is another good one. It is paid, however. Wunderlist is a great free to-do app, which is what's pictured here. I highly recommend that you have some system, whether it's a notepad or Todoist or Wunderlist, where you're managing your tasks and your productivity. And then, of course, a Trello. I mentioned the Trello board before, but Trello can actually double as a productivity tool, which makes it really handy. All right, so we've made it through the meat and potatoes of the content. If you're still here, well done. I just want to give you some parting thoughts. Number one is to be persistent. It's going to take a while to reach your goals in this industry, but it's worth it. Number two is to enjoy the journey. Enjoy making things. If you have this mindset of, I will be happy and satisfied once I am an X level composer, or I'm making X amount of money per year composing, you're going to have a tough life. It's going to be a slog. It's going to be a grind. Just enjoy the process. The actual art of arranging music, of making music, of putting MIDI on a screen and hearing it back through your speakers or through your headphones, and that joy of creating something. Just do your best to enjoy that whole process. You're just going to have a better time. Give yourself constraints. It's good to have constraints, whether that's technological constraints, whether that's compositional constraints, arranging constraints, your own mental constraints, time constraints. Constraints are good. Once again, steal stuff. I love stealing stuff, and you should too. Well, that's it, guys. Thank you so much for making it through this presentation. Again, I just want to ask a quick favor. Anything that you heard in this presentation that you want to hear more of, please leave either a comment if you're watching this natively on YouTube, or in the box below, leave your feedback, because I am creating a full course and I want to make something that is extremely valuable to my audience. So once again, I can't thank you enough for making it all the way through. I really hope that something in this was valuable, that there was a couple light bulb moments throughout this presentation, and that because of what I've shared here, you will be a more successful game composer. So thanks again, and have a great day.